and welcome to episode 175 of the Daily Fantasy Edge. My name is Adam Levitan. I am one of the analysts here at DraftKings. I'm the father of a very special lady, the most beautiful beast in the world, Jerry. And we are coming off of what I would call a tilting week. Chris Ivory stopped twice at the 1 yard line, stopped once from the 3 yard line. Michael Thomas getting 2 touchdowns overturned on replay. Redskins defense/special teams, which I thought was a sharp play, missing out on a touchdown by a shoelace. Davante Adams on his way to a huge game gets knocked out early in the third quarter on a really dirty play. Antonio Brown leaving in the first half with a calf injury. Failing to prioritize Greg Olsen in cash. A lot of tilt. And I actually wanted to start with the Greg Olsen thing because I think we can take a few things away from it. First, when judging someone's health, it's hard to do in the NFL. It's hard to know when somebody is actually 100% because all these guys, most of them are playing at less than 100%. But I think when judging it, we have to think logically, right? So if we zoom out, we talked about how Greg Olsen played on 92% of the snaps in week 14, ran a route on almost every one of Cam Newton's dropbacks that week. And then if the foot was still an issue, if it bothered him from all that usage, would he have practiced in full on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of week 15? Would that make any sense? Of course not, So I think we had a reasonable expectation that Greg Olsen was healthy. And let's think about what price he would have been, if he was healthy at home against the Packers without Kelvin Benjamin. Olsen probably would have been around $6K. And though, now let's think about the tight end position as a whole this past week. We had Gronk, obviously, really strong play, especially once Chris Hogan was ruled out, but very expensive. Then we had these 3 really thin, cheap options in Jesse James with Vance McDonald out, Ricky Seals-Jones with Jermaine Gresham out, and Charles Clay, who has been up and down, I think, due to health concerns, but again, really hard to say. But for just 1K more, and I know 1K meant a lot on the slate, but for, in theory, just 1K more, we could have had an actual ceiling, an actual real-life good NFL player in a good spot in Greg Olsen. So out of his 4K price tag, there's just little downside to that price, as I talked about in leverage. Just couldn't pull the trigger on it for me in cash, which was very frustrating. So again, I think the Olsen situation is a good reminder to focus on usage over box scores. And same with Sterling Shepard. Both those guys, their week 14 usage was massive. We really couldn't explain why they failed in the box score. The usage was massive. But if we got on them in week 15, kind of had the cojones, kind of was able to ignore what we saw the previous week, which is often so important in the NFL, then we could have put them in lineups and had a really big week 15. The NFL is like such a small sample size. It's why recency bias is so bad and so rampant. One game when a guy has good usage and doesn't perform oftentimes doesn't mean a lot. A couple other things from this past week. I first want to touch on the Chris Ivory situation. I had a lineup I liked for much of the week with Mike Davis in it, but I chose to find the 300 that I needed to get up to Chris Ivory. I just couldn't imagine a better spot, a better projected game script for Ivory than a home game against the Texans, right? Just like no shot for TJ Yates against this dominant Jaguars defense. That leads to tons of time of possession for the Jaguars, tons of red zone chances, tons of short fields, goal line chances, clock killing. And, that's exactly what happened. Chris Ivory was 4,300. Leonard Fournette, I thought if he was fully healthy, was an option at 7,400. So, it just didn't work out. I already mentioned all the chances that Chris Ivory had 17 carries in 2.5 quarters of play, 3 chances from inside the 3 yard line. And so even though I thought that Mike Davis, was a little bit underrated in the pass game, Ivory is right there with him in terms of catches per snap. So I was actually fine with that Chris Ivory decision. Just didn't work out. The other spot I wanted to mention was the Kenyan Drake one. And, kind of regardless of what you think of his talent or the Dolphins in general, this is a 3-down plus goal line back facing one of the league's worst rush defenses at 5,800. This role that Kenyan Drake is operating in right now is so absurd, playing 93% of the snaps the last 2 weeks. big part in the pass game, big part at the goal line. And he was 44% owned in the Millie Maker, which I thought was pretty reasonable and expected. The surprising part to me is that Kenyan Drake was only 74% owned in the big $25 double up, the single entry double up. And, I understand there were a lot of running back options, but at 5,800, like we don't get that role at 5,800 in a good matchup. And you could say, yeah, well, Gio Bernard had the same expected role with Joe Mixon out, but you just can't compare this disaster Cincinnati team with a lame duck coach going on the road against one of the league's best rush defenses, with one of the best defenses overall, to the spot that Kenyan Drake had. So that brings us to the 4-man and cash for this week. And the listeners have struck again. The listeners, after bricking out the first 12 weeks of the season, the listeners have captured 2 wins in the last 3 4-mans, which is awesome. This time it was Seahawks fan 69, a.k.a. GPate0308 on Twitter, was the only one to play Marquise Goodwin, which made a huge difference. Used Naked Cam. I got on Brandon Cooks, which I thought was sharp after the Chris Hogan news. Obviously, he had Le'Veon Bell and Kenyan Drake as locks. So Gabe has won the Week 14 Listener League. He sustained that high level by winning the Week 15 4-man. And now he's earned $100 cold hard cash from me, Peter, and Al, which must be used in the Week 16 SPY, the $100 single entry double up. The $100 single entry GPP on DraftKings. So big GL, big good luck to Gabe in that. Hope he makes a big splash. He'll tweet a link so that we can root him on. Updated 4-man standings now are myself, 6 wins, Peter, 5, Al, 2, and the listeners, 2. Let's get to the listener league for this past week, which was a 3,000 entry tournament, but for the first time all season, it did not fill. Disaster. Only 2711 entries, which is embarrassing, guys. Like, DraftKings is nice enough to give us this rake-free tournament, and then we let it overlay by 289 spots, make them come up with the overlay money. So let's get in early for Week 16. The instructions to get in are on your desktop. Go to DK Playbook. Find the logo for this podcast. Once you click on that logo, you will go to a landing page, which will have some videos. My hideous face talking to you. It will also have a link to the Week 16 Listener League, $5 buy-in, 3 entry max. Lots of fun all around. The winner of the Week 15 Listener League was Black Prince, and he or she had Cam at 23%, Olsen at 8%, Drake and Le'Veon as locks, as we already talked about, over 40%. Then some really interesting plays. Todd Gurley, 13%. I was very sold on playing Le'Veon Bell. I didn't even really consider trying to fit Gurley, on the road in Seattle, where I expected actually Seattle to play well. So I never really considered Gurley too much, especially in lineups with Le'Veon Bell. He also got on Nelson Aguilar, who I liked a lot. I actually ended up playing Nelson Aguilar in cash at 4,400, just such a big role and made sense with Nick Foles' skill set and a good matchup with the Giants. He played Keelan Cole at 2% and obviously benefited from the Marquise Lee injury, but Keelan Cole is one of those kind of punt plays that really worked out. Juju Smith-Schuster at 5% also benefited from Antonio Brown leaving, but I thought Juju was still a pretty reasonable play. Did expect him to play ahead of Martavis Bryant. So a really nice, strong lineup from Black Prince. We will see you in the Week 16 4-man. In second place was Nostromo. He also had Cam Olsen, Sterling Shepard, who I already talked about, down at 5%. Gurley, who I mentioned. Aguilar, who I mentioned. He did play Willie Snead, which I thought was an interesting play once Ted Ginn was ruled out. But Willie Snead has had his chances this year and failed so often. I also thought that there was risk in Willie Snead based on the Jets just not showing up. I mean, the Jets just getting absolutely trucked. And we've seen this defense and this run game for the Saints dominate so often that it's led to kind of a lack of ceiling for the Saints pass game. But the Jets ended up playing well. And Michael Thomas certainly had a big game. Could have had a way bigger game, as I mentioned. Nostromo also had a big hit on the Vikings defense at 17%. Thought they were awesome, especially, once we knew Mixon and Marvin Lewis and Burfict out. Like, they were just in such a tough spot to go in there and get trampled by the Vikings. So like that play. In third place was T. Mockness. He had Cam Olsen and brought it back with Randall Cobb. And, I kind of thought that the more I thought about it and looked at the way Jordy had played this year earlier with Aaron Rodgers, so touchdown dependent, that there was a chance that Jordy Nelson is just like, can't separate, like Dez style, like an awesome contested catch guy, an awesome red zone guy, but explosiveness and big plays just aren't going to happen from Jordy. Much more likely to happen from Devontae and Cobb. So I really like bringing it back with Cobb there if you were playing Cam and Olsen. And then he went with 3 RBs, and I thought 3 RBs was kind of the optimal this week. There were so many good RB plays. He did not play Le'Veon Bell, though. He played Mark Ingram, who just went absolutely ham. Todd Gurley, already talked about, and Latavius Murray, who I know a lot of sharp people were on. I did not end up playing any Latavius Murray. But Latavius Murray, I think I shy away from, like most people a lot of times, because Jerick McKinnon has this kind of sizable pass game role, but Latavius is still getting 15 to 20 carries plus goal line work every week against this Bengals team without Burfict, as I mentioned, and kind of really crumbling at the linebacker position and really struggling against the run. So congrats again to Black Prince, Nostromo, T. Mockness for their podium finishes in the Week 15 Listener League. Now we move to everybody's favorite portion of the program, the listener questions. Producer Luke, hit the theme music. All right, thanks to everyone as always for all the questions. Got a ton of good ones. Question 1 is from Vina Penny. Says, are there enough gold diggers around at DK Live Finals so even the hashtag Team No Sex DFS grinders can smell some roses? A very well constructed, well thought out question there, Vina Penny. There might be some gold diggers at these things, but then again, I'm not out clubbing, I'm not hanging out in the lobby until 4 a.m., etc. So it's not really my scene. So I haven't really seen it. I'll say this, though, about the Live Finals. It's always like incredibly fun, super hard to get there. And we've talked plenty about the bankroll implications of trying to get there and all that, also the frustration of like getting there and then not coming close to realizing the seat value, which happens to a huge part of the field. But I think from a life EV perspective, these Live Finals are so awesome, like such an unreal event. And like just being around a lot of people with similar interests, kind of feels like home. So I met a bunch of people, some knew us from the podcast or from Twitter or whatever, but others didn't, which, was really cool. Like a few guys who just ran hot and won a cheap qualifier. They have no idea there's like such a thing as projections or a DFS pod, et cetera, and that was awesome. So yeah, back to the question though, like in terms of like just tripping and falling into hashtag team sex at the live final, like I don't think that's really in the cards. It's just like everything else in life. People always want to think the grass is greener. People always say, I have this one friend, he's always like, oh, if I was rich, I would just be living on team sex. If I lived in New York City instead of, Podunkville, wherever, I'd be swimming in team sex. And, really it has nothing to do with it. So like, yeah, just being at a live final doesn't mean you just trip and fall into team sex. All right. Question 2 is from Colin Drew, AKA Drewby417. He says, if you could clone NFL DFS skills from 5 DFS players and merge them into one supercomputer, what skills would they be and who would you clone them from? Interesting question to think about for sure. I don't think I want to really be getting into naming people on here. And it's not like I know everyone who's good at DFS anyways, right? Like there's a lot of people who don't necessarily put themselves in the spotlight, may not be playing tournaments, may not be playing nosebleed stakes, may not even be playing, high stakes, but are still very good. But anyways, if I could clone skills, let's talk about skills. I think number 1, for me would obviously be game selection. If you've listened to this podcast the last 3 years, you know what I'm talking about. Like by far the most important skill. Like you can't just go for hashtag screenshots and play the Millie Maker only every week and expect a profit. Can you have fun like that? And is that the way that 99% of the field should be playing? Of course. But that's not how a supercomputer would play. The second skill I would clone is projections. And I think in order to be consistent, to have a really good process every week, you need to be working from some set of projections. Once you start getting into gut feels and letting your eyes do too much work, you become really susceptible to recency bias and just like unrealistic outcomes. Of course, making projections is wildly difficult, especially in the NFL where there's always subjectivity. If you think the carry split between Theo Riddick and Tion Green will be 70-30, and I think it'll be 50-50, well, we could both be really smart. We could both be working hard. We could both be math oriented and still come up with vastly different projections based on something subjective. So yeah, it's hard for sure. The third skill I would clone would be understanding news. What's real, what's coach speak, what's going on deep on the depth charts, which players are coming on in terms of usage, which ones are fading away in terms of usage, how are injuries impacting usage. All those things just so important, just following the news really, really closely. And then fourth and fifth will be something like roster construction, building lineups optimally. Once you have your player pool and once you have these projections, it tells you which players you like. Building lineups is certainly a skill that I'd like to clone. And then the last one would be projecting and exploiting ownership, which I'll talk more about in a second. But I think if you can project ownership accurately and you consider yourself a GPP player, it's a huge skill. Question 3 is from Blake Waddington. He says, my father-in-law is at my house putting in my flooring while I sit on my ass saving us about $2,500. He doesn't accept money. Should I bail from the house, act busy, hover, or just keep sitting my lazy ass on the computer while he does hard labor? Yeah, really tough spot, Blake Waddington, one that I have found myself in many a time. It's extremely emasculating, obviously. But that's kind of what comes with not being able to fix things, not being a real man. There are really no good plays here. I choose to hover, wait to see if I can help. And, by help, I mean go fetch a tool or go get him a glass of water or, read the instruction book or something. Honestly, like the worst part of this and the only motivation I have to learn to actually do stuff around the house is like setting such a bad example for my kid and, soon to be kids. Like we got my son his first bed a few months ago, like a car bed, and of course the thing comes in a zillion pieces. I'm on such tilt, nothing fits. You need to drill, you need to do all this crazy stuff. The holes don't line up. So I end up, I give it like 10 minutes and I just call some dude, and pay him to come put it together. In part because I'm incapable, but also because of a lot of like the life philosophy stuff I've talked about a ton on here before. I pay people to do all kinds of things for me, not because I'm rich, because I'm certainly not, and not because I'm lazy, but because the most valuable thing by far in life is time. Like the only thing that you have no idea how much you have of, the only thing that is like so finite is time. We can't literally buy more of it, but we can practically buy more of it by paying for all kinds of things, cleaning service, getting groceries delivered, putting together beds, laundry service, having someone else do your flooring, as Blake Waddington said. So I'm never going to feel too bad about having someone else do something when I think that my time can be put to better use. Question 4 is from Walter McMichael. Do we overrate ownership? I've been doing better in GPPs recently by ignoring ownership on optimal plays like Kenyan Drake this past week. So I've gotten this question a bunch lately. As I've said, I think one of the most interesting questions for GPPs on a weekly basis is whether to fade or play chalk, right? Is it good chalk or bad chalk? Certainly really hard. And I think there are times when it makes sense to ignore ownership, right? Like when we think a player just can't fail at his price. Gio Bernard, maybe Kenyan Drake this past week. But when we start thinking about GPPs from a game theory perspective, not from a football perspective, we see how important ownership is. Think about it like this. Like I always like to use exaggerated examples in some kind of theoretical things. So like an exaggerated example would be, let's say Kenyan Drake was you knew before last week's game started, Kenyan Drake would be 99% owned. Then what? Of course you would fade him then because you can literally gain on the entire field by finding a way to outscore him. And think about how many guys. I mean, this is one NFL football game. Yeah, Drake was an awesome play, as I mentioned. Think about how many guys below him or slightly above him or different constructions or whatever that could outscore Drake. So, of course, there's a point where each player is a bad play at a certain ownership level. It's a varying degree based on how strong the player is, how owned he's going to be. Now, all that said, if you can't get your head around, kind of that concept, or you're making mistakes, a lot of mistakes because of that, or you're making way too many fancy play syndrome plays, then by all means ignore it, especially in the smaller field GPPs. Question 5 is from Gator MAB. He says, after a long day of sweating lineups, what is your drink of choice for the Sunday night football game? I assume Gator is looking for some type of alcoholic response from me here, like, oh, after a long day of tilting my face off about Ricky Seals-Jones, I like to take 8 shots of Cuervo, yeehaw. That's not me. I actually think that our society's like dependence and promotion of and admiration of alcohol is a huge, huge problem. And again, like I've mentioned before on here, another thing that has history will not look kindly upon our generation for. But yeah, when I do drink, I normally just drink Crown on the rocks, Crown Royal on the rocks, have 2 or 3, feel legit terrible, can't wait to get to sleep. My drink of choice on Sunday Night Football and basically all other times is water. I drink an insane amount of water. If my pee is not clear, and I mean really clear, like not off-white, not a light yellow, I mean crystal clear, then I start chugging water. I would say I try to drink at least like 60 to 70 ounces of water a day and sometimes more. Just makes me feel good, makes me feel healthy, makes me feel strong. Water is the best. Oh, by the way, so I got into Miami at like 10 p.m. Last Wednesday night, and I went right up to my room, and I obviously needed some hydration. I didn't want to risk the Miami tap water right before the race, so the only water in this room is $9 bottles of Voss water. So I didn't have a choice. I didn't want to, but I chugged $18 worth of water in like 5 minutes. So absurd. Question 6 is from Stephen Kim. He says, Adam, do you feel like you were rope-a-doped on the mile challenge? Felt very fishy. Not rope-a-doped at all. Just a bad bet by me if we look at it from a monetary perspective, right? I guess first let me explain what Stephen Kim is referring to. I was out with Bales and Brandon Adams maybe like 2 months ago, and we were having dinner. We were talking about some fitness props, and we just decided to do a 1 mile race down in Miami right before the DK Live final. And, the reason it was such a bad bet from a financial perspective was simple, right? Like Brandon had more information than us. Bales and I had run a race down in Orlando about a year ago, last February. So BA knew our times, he had this information. So of course he thought he could beat us. Otherwise he wouldn't have made the bet. And, I know better, right? Like I've been doing this a long time. You never make a bet like that where you don't have more information than your opponent. But in reality, these fitness props aren't really about the money, right? It's about getting motivated for something positive in your life. And in this case, the race gave me motivation to actually exercise during football season, which is something I almost never do. So I ran 3 to 4 days a week. I'm in decent shape now. So in that sense, even though I lost the race, it was a good bet for sure. As for the running, though, man, it really is the worst, especially the mile. The whole idea is like push your body past what it wants to do, to put your body into so much pain. If you've never tried to run a mile quickly, like even in like under 8 minutes or something slowish like that, you really can't relate to what I'm talking about. So anyways, I trained a decent amount. As I said, 3 to 4 times a week, was running pretty hard. I just didn't have enough in the tank on lap 3 to stay with Brandon, who ended up running an absurd 5:33 mile, like totally absurd. And I think I can take some solace in the fact that no matter how much I trained, I could never do a 5:33. I ended up at 6:20, almost the same time I ran in Orlando, which was frustrating. But I honestly don't think I'll ever do a running bet again. It's just way, way, way too painful and really not fun. But anyways, congrats to BA. He ran a sick race and crazy impressive. Question 7 is from Ryan Hodge, friend of the podcast. He says, how does one get in on some prop bets? He would love some ping pong action versus Evan Silva. Yeah, I know Evan is sick at ping pong. I'm sure in the future, there's probably going to be like some betting market for prop bets for strangers, or maybe it's out there already. I already don't know. Like maybe you could post on this website, I want to play anyone in Miss Pac-Man for X dollars. Let's ride, meet here. Man, I'm just like giving out $1 million business ideas on here. Obviously not as strong as Gender Labs, aka Gender Consultants LLC, which by the way, I got a lot of questions down in Miami. People want consulting on positions. People want their ADOP tested. Lots of prospective clients I met down there. But anyways, to answer Hodge's question, I think the best props are more organic. Like you want to get something done, weight loss bet, whatever. You want to get something done. You want some motivation to do it, and you work out with somebody with a similar goal as you, and make sure you have enough money on the line to motivate you. And that's how it works. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm sure Silva will be happy to play you in ping pong, Hodge. Question 8 is from Nee Hall. With the holiday season right around the corner, what are your thoughts on regifting? I just got an Echo Dot from a client and literally have no use for it. I have no problem with regifting. None. Imagine you got like a Label Baby Junior. You don't want it. Why waste it? Why throw it away? Why put it in a closet never to be seen again? As long as you're careful and you don't get caught regifting, I really have no problem with it. But again, this goes back to what I talked about last week with gifts. Like no one has zero use for an experience. You can say you have zero use for a Echo Dot or a Label Baby Junior. No one has zero use for an experience. And even if they think they don't want to do something, like once they get out there and they do it, I think they'll appreciate it if it's cool. So like I remember one time for Valentine's Day, I took my wife to something called an aphrodisiac dinner, and they teach you like how to cook all these allegedly sexual foods. So like we ate oysters and like these big, thick asparagus spears and avocados and chili peppers. It was pretty dumb, but it was an experience, certainly better than a gift. And, I always tell the story about my birthday, like a couple years ago, the first year my son was born, like I was just on such rabid tilt, like was so depressed. Having a newborn is so awful. But my birthday came around and my wife asked me what I wanted. And I said what I actually wanted. I wanted a night in a hotel room by myself, literally all I wanted, and she got it for me, a nice room with a DoubleTree on Broad, maybe like 5 blocks away from my house. Was a glorious evening, was one of the best presents I ever got. And I've done it a few times since. So I guess the point is like, you never know what's a good gift, a material thing, but I think experiences, again, are always going to be better than things. Question 9 is from Irish Car Bomb. What are your thoughts on who to trust with financial decisions / investing? Saw the Darren McFadden story on Bitcoin and wanted your thoughts. Yeah, I just saw that story too. Apparently, Darren McFadden is suing like some financial guy, some financial advisor, because McFadden gave him money for a Bitcoin-related investment a while back, and it never went to that investment. It went to the guy's like party fund or slush fund or whatever, allegedly. And the $3 million investment, which was supposed to go to this BTC venture, would now be worth $237 million or something crazy. I have no idea how true that was. I have no idea what the venture was. It doesn't sound like it was straight buying BTC, which obviously would have been the best route. But to answer the question, I really wouldn't trust hardly anyone, especially when it comes to money. I certainly in general have trust issues, but I really only trust myself in a lot of things in life. And that's probably partially or mainly due to being an only child. But yeah, I really if something's important, I almost always want to do it myself. So I think the safest route is like one of these big financial firms for investing. It's unlikely you're going to absolutely crush or absolutely smash, with one of them, but you're not going to get screwed either. It's just like the safe play. So, I use like Fidelity for some IRA and college investing accounts. Shout out to one of the best friends of the show, Eric the Red, aka ETR. He's a big shot, king of the stiffs over at Fidelity. I trust ETR with my life, but I knew him before he worked at Fidelity. I don't know, man. Like, I guess it all depends on how much risk tolerance you have. But in general, I would really be hesitant to trust very many people whatsoever. Question 10, last question we're going to do today is from friend of the podcast, Ryan Noonan. He says, if I'm going to pee, isn't the optimal move to wash my hands first before holding my junk? This feels especially necessary in public restrooms. Yeah, so I've actually seen a lot of people do this, and I get it to some degree, but I'm going to disagree overall, which I believe is going to surprise Ryan. I don't think it's optimal or necessary to wash your hands before peeing. Of course, you enter the bathroom with dirty hands, no doubt. But when you hold your junk, as Ryan said, to pee, you aren't like entering any orifice, right? You're merely touching skin. I don't see how that's any different than touching your arm or your face. The activities you need to wash your hands before partaking in are nose picking, eating, rubbing your eyes, anything that will allow germs to penetrate your system. So that's why we must wash our hands after the bathroom. Then we have germs and we have this like general fecal matter from the air on our hands. And those must come off because we know we're going to scratch our eye at some point. We know we're going to go for a nose pick at some point. So yeah, I think that post-wash is by far more important than pre-wash. And I would actually argue that pre-wash in this situation is not all that necessary. All right, we'll be back late Thursday night, back on normal schedule with the 3-man game-by-game breakdown for Week 16. Can't believe it is Week 16 already. You can send Q&A questions anytime to @DFSEdge on Twitter. For Jerry, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody. We are promoters at DraftKings and also avid fans. Our usernames are Adam Levitan, Al Smizzle, and CSU Ram 88. We may sometimes play on our personal accounts in the games that we offer advice on. Although we have expressed our personal view on the games and strategies in this podcast, they do not necessarily reflect the views of DraftKings, and we also may deploy different players and strategies than what we recommended in this podcast.